Die Jugend ist unverschrieben und verfallen mit Leib und mit Seele.
A new dawn on the 6th of June. The Royal Yacht Britannia moves calmly towards the Normandy coast, carrying the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, and steadily on through the lush farmlands where thousands fought and died 40 years ago. Those who were young then and survived are now 60 years and more. Each year their ranks are thinned. And so today, possibly for the last time, the kings and queens and presidents of the nations which took part in that great crusade into Europe have come together with the veterans of those times to honor their great feats of arms and their dead in pomp and ceremony and in simple acts of devotion and remembrance. They are not forgotten either by the children of France, who are patiently taught what happened during those war years, and who each 6th of June remember in their own way those who fell in that horrendous fight against Nazi Germany.
By the start of 1944, Hitler's Reich still stretched deep into the Soviet Union, throughout the Balkans, and from the north of Norway down to the Spanish frontier. The one place where the British and Americans were established on the mainland of Western Europe was in Italy, but still south of Rome. Churchill and Roosevelt, at their meetings, had agreed from the first that the Western Allies must one day land in France and push from there into Germany to end the war. Stalin, facing the bulk of the German army, was adamant that there must be a second front in the West as soon as possible. But there were divisions. The Americans liked the idea of a landing in the south of France as a diversion. Churchill opposed it. He preferred operations in the Aegean and around Trieste at the top of the Adriatic. Stalin opposed that. He didn't want the West in the Balkans. The British and American strategic bomber commanders insisted they could bomb Germany into defeat anyway without a landing. Hitler did not believe the war was lost. He had his new flying bombs, the V-1s, almost ready to send against London. He had his new U-boats equipped with the snorkel breathing apparatus with which to resume the Battle of the Atlantic. And he had his new Messerschmitt jet fighter, the first in the world, about to go into production to destroy the Allied bombers. But when General Eisenhower arrived in London on January the 15th, 1944, it was plain there would be an Operation Overlord, a landing in northern France, which both sides believed would decide the war. For it, the Western Allies mustered in, or just off Britain, 1 3/4 million British troops, 175,000 Dominion troops, chiefly Canadian, 1.5 million American troops and airmen, 44,000 from the other Allies, 4,000 heavy bombers, 5,000 fighters, 3,500 troop-carrying gliders, 1,200 fighting ships, 4,000 assault ships, and 1,600 merchant and supply ships. Roosevelt and Churchill, settling their differences, issued on February the 12th the historic directive to Eisenhower and his deputy Montgomery for a D-Day in May or earlier. It told them, in round terms, you will enter the continent of Europe and undertake operations aimed at the heart of Germany and the destruction of her armed forces. The Pas de Calais worried Hitler and the Germans most. It was the shortest and quickest sea crossing. There were ports round the coast from Ostend to Boulogne where the Allies could land supplies. The Allied fighters could give air cover longer. Above all, a very short thrust eastwards would take the Allies to the Ruhr. Hitler, far away in his headquarters in East Prussia, was always fatally ready to be persuaded that the main thrust would come in the Pas de Calais. He kept his best armour there. The British from the beginning preferred Normandy. They liked its beaches. They thought it would be less well defended. They believed they could quickly clear Cherbourg and the small ports of Brittany. And they thought they could pull the German defenders west and destroy them in good tank country. There were diversionary ideas. The Americans still liked a small landing in the south of France. There was even talk of a shot at Bordeaux, but landing craft were short. The British, and especially the Canadians, remembered the hard fighting in the raid on Dieppe. The Germans would not give up. Churchill spoke gloomily of the Channel floating with the cream of our youth. What mattered was that the Allies had learned from their mistakes at Dieppe. For the German commander Rommel, the veteran of Africa, the lesson was that the invasion would be stopped on the beaches or nowhere. The Atlantic Wall became his obsession. Obstacles were built in the fields and the tidewater. He was everywhere. Concrete was poured, artillery in place, and 6 million mines were laid. But the day before the landing, he left to see his family and Hitler. He thought the weather was too bad for a landing.
Eisenhower made a name for himself in a series of staff jobs rather than commanding troops. He was always more of a chairman and conciliator than a battlefield general, and skilled in persuading people of very different views to work together. Montgomery was chosen to command the land forces in the invasion after his successes against the Germans in North Africa and Sicily. Having fought through the First World War, he was a cautious commander, dedicated to everything he did and not willing to waste lives. Preparation was all important. Rommel, a fine tactician and leader of men, achieved a charismatic reputation fighting against the British in North Africa. Defeated by Montgomery at El Alamein, he returned to Germany and was given the task of repelling the expected invasion. He wanted to stop an invasion at the water's edge. He fell out with his superior, von Rundstedt, who wanted to hold reserves back to deliver a classical counterblow. An officer in the traditional Prussian mold and known as the Black Knight of the German army, he was respected by Hitler, who reappointed him 3 times after retirement and dismissal.
Plans for a full-scale Allied invasion of Europe began as early as 1942, 2 years before the big day. And within a year, despite the setback at Dieppe, and despite the continuing U-boat campaign in the Atlantic, preparations were accelerating at an almost uncontrollable rate. 1/4 of all British steel for new ships was going into landing craft production. By now, the country was being invaded by shiploads of American troops, all determined to trample over Hitler's occupying forces. As well as their hardware, they brought their habits along too. They came at the rate of 200,000 men a month. The target was an Allied army totaling 3 million soldiers. From the highlands to the southern beaches, the country was becoming one giant supply and training ground. And while the public called for an immediate second front, American troops scaled cliff faces in Scotland. In Northern Ireland, British and Canadian infantrymen were put through terrifying maneuvers by day and by night. And in London, the suburb of Battersea was turned into a fighting school, complete with a make-believe enemy. The trials, especially for the vulnerable frontline machinery like the floating, hopefully fireproof tanks, went on relentlessly. Mine-clearing vessels using chain-link flails went through their rehearsals as commanders built up a clearer picture of what could or could not be overcome. Technicians, meanwhile, continued experiments to perfect the floating docks, later to become the famous Mulberry harbours, which were vital to the British supply link. By April 1944, the area from Land's End to the Wash was choked with men and machines. The US forces concentrated west of Southampton. The British and Canadians camped east of Portsmouth.
It was similar to a concentration camp. Military police all around, just not allowed out. We had an idea something was going to happen, but we didn't really know what.
The morale of the battalion was extremely high, very, very high indeed. And there was an air of expectancy. I don't think there was any feeling of fear. The men were sharp.
It was light most of the time, and it was work as far as the chap's concerned. And actually, I think the most amazing thing was how well the secret was kept.
While the troops swatted over French books and collected their foreign currency, another operation just as vital to D-Day as the military build-up was coming to its climax. This was the campaign to keep the Germans guessing and confused about when and where the invasion would take place. The deception campaign, Fortitude, was designed to draw the enemy away from the Normandy beaches.
The object which I produced for the Field Marshal to agree, so far as I can remember, was simply this: to make the enemy reinforce the Pas-de-Calais area at the expense of the invasion area, and to retain the enemy forces in that area of Pas-de-Calais for as long as possible after D-Day. We achieved our object. I couldn't believe how long the enemy was stupid enough to stay sitting in the Pas-de-Calais.
But they did, as decoy Air Force bombers dropped twice as many explosives around Calais compared with Normandy. In addition, hundreds of radio signals announcing the movements of fictitious armies and convoys were fed across the channel. Allied landing craft, PT boats and minesweepers maneuvered off the East Anglian coast and headed out to sea to put the Germans further off trail. Every possible trick was used to confuse the enemy and support the Calais invasion theory. These were part of a battery of false inflatable tanks and trucks which could be packed up and carried away. The American general, Patton, who the Germans were convinced would take a leading part in D-Day, was photographed on inspection tours opposite the Pas-de-Calais, his presence there adding to the deception. Even Montgomery seemed to be in two places at once. The actor Clifton James, seen here in the film I Was Monty's Double, impersonated the general in Gibraltar, adding to rumours that the British could be preparing an invasion from Italy or Africa against southern France.
Oh, yes, Carlton. We're old friends. Nice to see you again, Carlton.
Thank you, General.
We lost a few enemies since we last met.
Yes, indeed, sir.
Took us a bit of time. Got there in the end. We haven't stopped yet. We'll save some for you.
I hope so, sir.
Good.
Back to reality, and by June 1944, the mighty assault force, the real one, was ready. The bluff was over. Now, in the words of Eisenhower, a great human spring was coiled, ready to vault the English Channel.
When the Allies landed on the Normandy beaches, they knew where virtually every German gun battery was positioned, largely due to the work of the French resistance. They knew what caliber the guns were, and even how many troops manned them, and how thick their concrete protection was. From the day the Germans marched into Paris, thousands of French people began working for their liberation. Many left for England to join de Gaulle's Free French forces. Others stayed, some to fight in the armed bands of the Maquis, and many more to work secretly, spying on the Germans. All risked their lives. Many were tortured to betray their comrades, but the network continued to grow. The resistance built up vital maps for the Allies by recruiting agents who lived inside the restricted coastal areas of northern France. As the beach defenses expanded, local doctors, farmers, builders memorized details on their daily rounds, pacing out distances between gun batteries and ferreting out information from building contractors. Perhaps the biggest coup by the resistance was pulled off by René Duché, a painter and decorator from Caen. In 1942, as work got underway on the Atlantic Wall, he stole a detailed plan of the whole French section from under the noses of the German engineers. His widow Odette remembers how he did it.
C'est un petit peu par hasard, en passant devant la mairie de...
It was rather by chance. The German engineers building the wall advertised for someone to decorate two of their offices in their Caen headquarters in the Rue de Jules. My husband went along and made a very cheap estimate so he could win the contract and take a snoop round. Whilst he was in the office of the Gauerleiter, he saw a pile of maps on his desk marked top secret. When the officer had his back turned to speak to his secretary, my husband, completely on impulse, took one of the maps and stuffed it behind a large mirror which was hung leaning out slightly from the wall. My husband went back later to do the decorating and to pick up the map, but the Gauerleiter had been relieved of his post because they'd found the map was missing. My husband had some difficulty getting into the office, but eventually managed to smuggle the map out in a roll of wallpaper. Funnily enough, the Germans never suspected him because the Gauerleiter had been with him in the room the whole time.
René Duché delivered the map through the resistance network to the head of the Century Group, Colonel Rémy. But the map only just made it across the channel. Rémy came under Gestapo suspicion and had to flee with his wife and 4 children. Madame Rémy vividly remembers the terrifying journey on the tiny Normandy fishing trawler.
We arrived in the trawler at the German checkpoint at 5 o'clock. I can show you on this model. I hid in the left-hand back locker with one child, the 2 others were in the right, and my husband and 16-month-old baby were under the forward hatch along with the Duché map. The Germans came alongside. They were checking every other boat that left the port that morning. We heard their steps up and down the deck, but they never checked the hold, and all of a sudden the motor started up and we were away. It was a miracle.
The crucial map, tied up with bundles of other intelligence reports, escaped in the trawler with the Rémy family to London. No one in the French resistance knew at that time how important the map was, but Colonel Rémy believes it convinced the Allies that Normandy was the best landing place. After the war, the colonel, now a frail 80 years old, was thanked by the American General Omar Bradley, who said,
"Thanks to a map that was brought to England in June 1942, that the point of landing was chosen. The details were so perfect, from Cherbourg to the Seine, guns, pillboxes, blockhouse, and so on. The informations were so precise that we lost the minimum of men and material."
With the coming of D-Day, resistance fighters all over France rose up to carry out previously established sabotage plans against railroads and highways. Each unit received the order to go ahead through secret messages broadcast by the BBC.
Before D-Day, we were given 5 messages that were to be heard. The first one within a week before D-Day, and the others later to give the order for sabotage. Radios were banned. The Germans had requisitioned all radios. When myself, with the help of a friend, I built a crystal set, and the crystal was there, and I kept this part hidden in a tin, and I kept the tin in the cellar with dry beans on the top, and I kept the earphones in the attic in an old trunk with old things. And it was only 2 or 3 times a day that I would connect the two. And then we knew the time at first, thanks to some leaflets that were dropped. L'Angleterre vous parle. England is speaking to you.
Clarisse a les yeux bleus. Gustave est très doux. Lily embrasse Mimi.
The resistance forces had already received hundreds of tons of arms and explosives parachuted in by the RAF. The Normandy Maquis group of St. Clair were told to attack military convoys heading for the beachheads and, just south of Caen, at the station of Grambozo to blow up the strategic railway line which could be used to bring up German reinforcements from Le Mans. 5 members of the group cycled across country for over 7 hours on the night of D-Day after they received their secret BBC message, "The dice are on the carpet." André Hérissi was the group's explosives expert.
What I had to do was find the joints in the line in the dark and place the plastic explosives underneath at 4 places like that. When it went off, woof, 8 rails were destroyed. I put a bit too much in that night, and the explosion was so enormous that a good 2 minutes afterwards there were stones raining down on us. It was a bit dodgy.
Dozens of other Maquis groups sabotaged railway lines and cut communications on the night of D-Day. The resistance itself claims it delayed the movement of 12 divisions to Normandy for from 8 to 15 crucial days. By then, the beachheads were secure, and the Germans were slowly being forced back. But before they left, they made sure that at least some of the resistance fighters would not witness the liberation.
In the main prison in Caen, there were almost 100 of our men who had belonged to the French resistance, who had been caught by the Germans and who were there. And on that morning, in the very early hours of D-Day, those poor men who'd done so much to prepare that landing and save so many lives, and who were probably longing more than anyone else for that liberation we were all hoping for, 87 of them were shot by the Germans. It lasted all day.
In the early light, the wind barely moves across the beaches which the invasion forces stormed. Forces which included Free French commandos, coming back to those who'd waited through 1,000 terrible days and nights of enemy occupation for their return. Also remembered are those who sailed these waters, in the thousands of small craft which brought 3.5 million men right onto the beaches, and in the warships offshore. Today, these men are saluted. And so too are those who'd flown above them. A single Lancaster bomber, a Hurricane, and a Spitfire in the distinctive 3 white bands of the D-Day invasion force, the last remnants of an air force that had kept the skies free and the enemy contained during that great combined operation. The plan was for an invading force to land between Le Havre and Cherbourg, with Caen as a key objective. In the west, the Americans would land on Utah and Omaha. In the east, the British and Canadians would land on Gold, Juno and Sword. In the dark hours before dawn, paratroopers would drop to secure both the western and eastern flanks, before the seaborne forces came in through mine-swept channels, the Americans landing first and the others, because of a tide difference, an hour later. Offshore, warships would add their fire to the aerial bombardment being carried out by thousands of bombers.
The ship that fired the opening shots on that day 40 years ago is still afloat. The heavy cruiser HMS Belfast, now a museum moored near Tower Bridge in London. As her 6-inch guns began bellowing broadsides at 5:30 that morning, they signaled the start of the heaviest naval bombardment in history. But then the fleet behind HMS Belfast was the most massive ever gathered. Warships of all sizes, merchant navy vessels of every type, some for specific invasion needs. Nearly 5,000 vessels in all. In every port along the south coast and elsewhere, men had been loading for days. And on to other vessels went the tanks, the guns, the ammunition. They knew the invasion was on, but they still didn't know where or when. Some harbors were so jammed, they meant it when they said you could walk across them without getting your feet wet. As the ships moved out and began gathering in the Solent, there was a bagpiper on one to play them on their way.
We switched on our loud hailer, and the pipes scored. If you can imagine a line of 24 infantry landing craft in close formation, the decks crowded with commanders wearing their famous green berets, and it seemed to set the Solent on fire. I shall never forget it. The troops in the big transports lining the decks, they just cheered madly. And the cheers rolled from ship to ship. From Stokes Bay to Ryde, you could hear it.
Finally, the order to sail. All through the Solent, ships began moving out to join convoys from other ports for the journey that would end on the beaches of Normandy. Ahead, far ahead, and alone, the tiny minesweepers cleared channels almost right up to the beaches to let the mighty armada sail with almost total confidence.
Almost every gallon of water had been covered by some ship of some sort, you see. They were so close, and so many of them. It was like Piccadilly Circus. Anyone who followed the first wave of ships out, they were perfectly safe.
It was truly fantastic. We'd sailed 60 convoys through 10 mineswept channels, and I couldn't help feeling, well, the planners had done a wizard job.
But a unique view of the invasion force head-on was seen by the 5 men in this midget submarine, filmed on the actual invasion day, whose job was to mark, on the surface, the limits of the Anglo-Canadian beaches with lights and flares.
As we surfaced, and of course a lot of work going on, putting up the mast, and you can imagine in the weather as it was, which was still rough, sticking up an 18-foot telescopic mast and the various other gadgets, that one had a quick look to seaward, and one saw the invasion force just as the Germans would, and it was terribly frightening. Although we knew they were on our side, it was still very frightening, and I can imagine the Germans' feelings.
First instructions were to obliterate all the German concrete fort emplacements, giving them all that we had, and do it as soon as possible.
Our smoke layers were laying smoke before they were worked. Here and there it would clear a bit, and you get a damn good view of ships such as Warspite, Frobisher and Ramillies and Richelieu. They're all having a go.
It was so horrifying that there were French people there, our own allies. We had to go and bombard them, and with the best will in the world, it's almost inevitable that many of them lost their lives.
And now, the final moment had come. The moment to board the assault craft and head into the beach.
Everybody had butterflies in their stomach. Right approaching the beach, you know, everybody was quiet, not the usual jovial selves, and I suppose everybody has their thoughts and their own anxieties, as you normally did, realising what a great armada it was, and if we should fail, what a chaos it would be.
But now, the surviving German guns began to zero in.
It was much less than we expected, because I think the initial air bombardment and the big guns from our battleships, such as Warspite, had really done a job and rather stunned the Germans to begin with. It only hotted up as we got close to the beach.
The first ones in, especially, were taking very heavy punishment and were being blown to pieces. But as there was such a lot of them, obviously quite a few were getting through. Mostly small arms fire, light machine guns, sniper fire. The fella behind me on the landing craft was hitting the ruin. The fella on the port side was killed outright. I remember seeing his blood spurting out.
Low over the beach, an RAF plane gave the first account of the landing.
It looked almost like a regatta. When eventually they actually touched down, it really was an extraordinary sight when these people, you know, literally the fronts of the ships came down and they leapt ashore in a very excited way.
And this is what it had all been about, to put these men on this beach. Now, many of the ships began heading home, but not empty. This time they carried part of the price of the landings, the wounded. The Allied air forces had, in fact, won the air battle of D-Day well before the first landing craft hit the beaches. In a series of concentrated attacks, they'd cut road and rail communications into the invasion area, making it impossible for the Germans to move reinforcements in those first vital hours, the hours which would decide the success or failure of the whole enterprise. By the end of the attacks, there was only one main bridge left between Paris and the Normandy coast, and hardly a single working railway engine. This map shows the success of the Allied attacks. Every single road and rail junction to the beachheads had been hit. But the first preparations for D-Day had begun well before, with night and day heavy bombing of German aircraft factories and synthetic fuel centers. Not only did this very nearly cripple the Luftwaffe, it also forced them to withdraw fighters from France to try, unsuccessfully, to halt the attacks. Thus, on D-Day itself, by the Germans' own admission, their fighters were outnumbered over the beaches more than 10-to-1 by Allied planes. Those that weren't shot out of the skies were destroyed on the ground. Some Allied pilots never saw an enemy plane at all on D-Day.
We were getting a certain amount of ground opposition. You know, everything that was on shore was having a go at anything that moved. But I personally saw no aerial opposition at all. And I had a very good number 2 with me, and he would have warned me if there'd been anything about.
The main work, therefore, for the Allied air forces on D-Day was to stop all German movement on the roads or the railways, and this they did with devastating effect.
We just saw the Allied air like flies on the sky. As soon as we were on the road, we were spotted and shortly later attacked by fighter bombers. And I lost 3 or 4 times, and we were delayed all the time.
The delays to German reinforcements, by hours and sometimes by days, were crucial in letting the Allied armies establish themselves firmly on the beachheads. For the Allies, D-Day marked the culmination of the most massive, prolonged air assault of the European war, and also possibly the biggest air victory of that war. Bitter air battles still lay ahead, but from here on, the end could be seen.
The very first great feat of arms took place in the darkness of the opening moments of that day. And 40 years on, veterans of that raid gather at the same place, at the same time, as they crash-landed their gliders here, just by Pegasus Bridge on the eastern end of the invasion area. It had been a position vital to take quickly and hold before the seaborne troops hit the beaches.
And lastly, the toast, absent comrades. Absent comrades. Alain, Georgette. Good out, Pete. Hooray!
And later, in the full light of day, they march along proudly through the French people lining the roads. And then, in the warm summer sunshine, they mingle in the tree-lined square.
The crucial operation in the first half hour of D-Day was to capture intact the bridges over the Caen Canal and the Orne River. It was carried out by a single company of glider-borne forces, D Company of the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry. Their achievement in that half hour has become a legend, and the pinpoint landing of the gliders has been called the greatest feat of flying in the Second World War. The overall airborne strategy was to secure the east flank of the whole invasion area, to capture those vital bridges in the Orne Valley, to destroy others in the Dives Valley, and to put out of action the key artillery battery at Merville. All this had to be done before dawn, when the main seaborne force would land. If the operation failed, thousands of lives would be lost on the beaches. The intention of the glider attack was to deliver a swift, unexpected blow. Thus the gliders took a giant loop to achieve maximum surprise. At airfields all over the south of England, the gliders, frail things of wood and canvas, massed on the night of June the 5th. D Company of the Ox and Bucks was commanded by Major John Howard, a former Oxford policeman. The time came to board the gliders. The men carried so much equipment they had to be helped on board. The Halifax bombers, the towing aircraft, were started up. The gliders took the strain of the tow rope and were hauled from the ground. The invasion had begun.
Down below, we took our last look at the countryside, realizing that before we got back we had to be engaged in one of the greatest battles of the war. We were all excited, exhilarated. I suppose in a way it was like being picked to play for your country or your country. Very silently we began swoop down to the ground. Now at this time the soldiers were still singing Roll Out the Barrel and It's a Long Way to Tipperary and all the songs that they sang. And as we got closer and closer to the ground and I could see the rivers and the bridges in front of me, I thought it wouldn't be a very good idea if there were any Germans on the ground to hear these English songs being sung in the air above them. It might give away the secrecy of the operation.
We're flying now close to the canal, parallel to the canal, and I had just said to the troops in the back, we may undershoot. Be prepared if we do, right, to just charge up the canal bank and take the bridge there. And at that point, I'd hardly said the words when, bingo, we saw the bridge coming up.
Well, when we finished on the impact of landing, the whole thing stopped and there was complete silence. So the door I was sitting in front of a few minutes earlier and opened, because we'd opened it in flight after we'd cast off from the Halifax bombers, had completely disappeared and it all collapsed because we'd telescoped. The poor glider pilots had thrown right through the cockpit, over the wire at the front, and we could hear them moaning, but we couldn't do anything about it because our great thing then, knowing we were on dock, first here, was to capture that bridge intact.
My job was, as a brain gunner, was to rush the right-hand side of the bridge. Danny Brotheridge got up, said, "Come on, lads." He ran, I followed him. I went across the right-hand side of the bridge. So as we made our approach to it, I saw a German sentry which looked like a very light pistol in his hand, and I fired and he went down. But at the same time he pulled the trigger of the very light and it went. You know, there was a bright light went up. And still firing, we went across.
I stopped and looked across the bridge just for a brief second, looked at it,
then shot over. And as I turned, one of the dugout doors from there half open and closed again. I don't know if somebody went in or went to come out and in. And shot across. By this time I had a 36 grenade with a pin out into the dugout, shut the door, the explosion went, and Charlie in. Banged the door open again and he just machine gunned onto the second dugout, the same. In with a grenade, bang the door shut, explosion, smash it wide open again. Charlie finished off. As we came past the first dugout, something as a moan or a word from inside, and I pulled out a 77 phosphorus. Took the cap off, give it a twirl, undone the tape, and jumped in. That went off. We was up. Major Al was over here at the time. There was all hell going over there. There was blokes scrambling. They were knocking out the pillbox. Others was over there sorting the gun out and sorting people out over there. But by this time, everybody else was beginning to stream across.
Men running across the bridge. It was full moon, very little, only a few clouds about. Then I recognized they're British soldiers. It can't be land forces, so they must have come out of the air. Either Paras or Airborne troops, you know. So I opened up, kept slowly forwards, watched my blokes, said, come on. I gave them the order, don't start firing before I fire. Wait for me. I think we made more or less more noise than hitting anybody. So at the end, we stayed there near the bridge, roughly about 100 yards. And I more or less ran out of ammunition. Then I give the order back. What can I do with 4 men? There's no hope for me.
As the hours wore on, the men of 7 Para came in to relieve the ox and bucks. Wally Parr turned his attention to a captured gun.
The fellas was down there with me and they were keeping an eye open with binoculars and also they say there's one over there and I'd swivel the gun round, bang, shall it go over there, then over there. It was the time of our lives with this thing, you know. I mean, we were drunk with power. We'd never had one this size. I mean, Smythers we knew about and MGs, German MGs, but this one, I mean, you're 22 years of age and it's all going and you've got a thing like this for the first time. It's really something. And as I say, we had a time of life. The only thing is Major Howard's command post was over there. And he had a lot of these mine, a lot of communicating to do backwards and forwards. And from time to time, he put it, I don't know, for Christ's sake, keep that bloody gun quiet for 5 minutes. That sort of thing.
I decided at this stage to make myself a brew of tea. And got down below this bloody gun position at Wally Parr and Charlie Gardner were manning, which they'd been firing. And I said to them, you know, I'm just going to have a cup of chow down here. Don't fire that bloody gun with it, you see. And I don't know if you know the old Tommy cooker, but it takes about 20 minutes to get tea decent enough for making a brew. And I just got the bloody thing up to the boil. The old bubbles were just, I can remember this so clearly. The bubbles were coming up and I said, don't fire that bloody gun. And I heard old Wally shout out a fire order and the gun went off. The sand fell out of the top of the bunker. I had a cup of mud down below and no bloody tea. And I was not very pleased. I mean, I was not the wildest man in Benneville village at that particular moment, I reckon.
But there were other extraordinary moments in that extraordinary morning, as Todd Sweeney found out.
I was sitting next to my fellow platoon commander, Dennis Fox, when I heard what I thought were the sound of bagpipes. So I nudged Dennis and I said, Dennis, I can hear some sound sounds like bagpipes. And he said, oh, don't be silly, Todd. You can't hear bagpipes. We're in France. They don't have any bagpipes in France. So we dozed a little while for a few more seconds, and I said, no, I can distinctly hear, listen. So we listened, and above the sort of odd noises that were going on, you could hear the wailing of a bagpipe.
It turned out to be Brigadier Lovett and his piper who were coming with their commando brigade to our rescue, having landed at Ouistron.
When I first heard I was playing bagpipes in Normandy, I heard about bagpipers of the Great War, 1418 War, and before that. But in modern warfare, bagpipers in battle, this seems rather strange to me. But I think I was very fortunate to play the bagpipes with the 1st Commando Brigade and the greatest military venture in the history of warfare.
But there was a price to pay. Dan Brotheridge died on the bridge, the first casualty.
I ran onwards to RV where we should have met Dan out there, and I ran past him. I didn't realise it was him. He was laying over in that point there, about 20 yards past the cafe in the middle of the road. His head was towards the bridge and his feet that way, and I ran past him. I thought it was a German at first, and then I stopped and realised and came back, and there it was. It lasted about 4 minutes. It was a terrible shock. A few minutes before and an hour or so before, we got on laughing and talking to each other, and that's what I found.
And that's when it came home to you.
Terrible waste. It's the first thing that went through my mind. A terrible waste. Lovely fellow.
Dan Brotheridge is buried in Renville Military Cemetery, where many of the airborne men lie. 40 years on, his comrades remember him.
I can remember him coming to the company. He's very, very popular. And he knitted us all together. Very popular man.
My greatest buddy and friend, Dan Brotheridge, with whom I had shared a room for the last 18 months. We'd gone out together in the evenings. We'd gone to have a drink at the pub. We'd often sat together and talked about what it would be like to go into action. And I suppose this was the moment of truth when you realized that it wasn't all just a great game and fun. It was a serious business and people were going to be killed.
The Germans believed that their 4 guns at Merville were virtually impregnable. The British committed a whole battalion, the 9th Para, to storm the battery. But the airborne drop went badly wrong. Of 650 men, only 150 were in place to make the attack. The RAF had plastered the place, but scarcely scratched it. The omens were not good.
I wasn't frightened. I was apprehensive. Very much so. Just going into the unexpected. Although you've trained for a year and you've had the best training, you still get butterflies in the stomach. We all got out in the right time and landed on the DZ in the right position. I knew exactly where I was coming down on the parachute. And I knew I was in the right place, and I thought everybody else would be. We go down to the corner, we take up our all-round defensive position, which is automatic training. And all that time we were having little whispers, very quietly, of course, very observant, not knowing whether the next person you saw would be a German. Not many of us here, is there? And gradually the whisper went round. We hadn't heard a shot fired, anything at all. We hadn't seen a German. The whisper went round that there was a lot of us missing. There weren't very many of us.
You don't have any option in those circumstances. No option at all. I mean, you can't pull out on a thing like that. You're told to do it. Think of the effect. If we hadn't put those guns out of action, think of the effect that there might have been on the 3rd British Division and on the Canadian Division who were coming over the beaches, due to come over the beaches the next morning about 7 o'clock. There would have been carnage on the beaches. That alone meant we had to do it.
Our platoon commander and the man that was going to lead our section, at least, into the assault was Lieutenant Jefferson, who we called Twinkle Toes because he was a ballet dancer. He came along, creeping along on his hands and knees,
And he was saying, come on, lads, there's your chance to get the bastards. Now's your chance, he said. They've been bombing your wives, your sweethearts, your families. Now's your chance to get your own back and stop all this.
We were snookered. We had to get out of the snooker, and we got out of it by making 2 gaps, 2 assault parties through each gap. They didn't completely blow the wire, and so men had to lie on their stomachs on the wire so that their colleagues could run over their backs inside.
We went straight into these guns, grenades were thrown in, and the prisoners came out of the left-hand apartment, and they came out and pushed each other out.
The German garrison numbered 200 men. Only 22 prisoners were taken. Of the 150 British paras, only 65 walked away.
One cannot put it into words. One cannot explain what those chaps went through so that we've got the freedom we've got today.
We, as a battalion, had a job to do, and we did it to the best of our ability.
Eisenhower didn't expect this American airdrop to be easy. He was to be proved right, and some soldiers to whom he chatted saw this concern on his face. 13,000 heavily laden paratroopers and glider infantry were setting out that night from airfields scattered round the south and west of England. Ahead, a dangerous night drop on enemy territory. These were the last peaceful moments they were to have.
It was a cloudy night, and just as we were over the channel, the moon broke through the clouds, and the channel, of course, became quite silver, and you could see the outline of these ships in all directions. Tremendous force. All you had to do was see that fleet to know we couldn't lose. There was nothing that was going to stop that. So it was quite a sight from the air. So we spent most of our time looking out the windows.
I could look back and see the most comforting sight. As far as I could see, there were airplanes, a lot of them, 9 across, V, way back, just as far as you could see. And all of a sudden, it was like hitting a brick wall. We hit a cloud bank, a fog bank. And you always attribute to the enemy the unknown when it occurred. And you didn't know what was going to happen, so we figured it must be putting up smoke, just putting up a big fog wall. And he wasn't. It was just natural fog, and it drifted in. But suddenly, in about 3 minutes, it opened. Buildings on fire, black, zigzagging across the sky, all on fire, tracers. And off to the right was a town surrounded by heavy anti-aircraft weapons. And there before it was a whole battle scene. St. Mary-Glees in the distance.
St. Mary-Glees is a small town and was at the center of the whole American airdrop. On the only main road right through the region, it was absolutely essential to capture it quickly. The plan was this. The 2 divisions would fly west to east across the peninsula. 3 regiments of the 82nd Division were to drop west of this main road with 2 main objectives. 1, to seize the river crossings on the Medere River. 2, to capture St. Mary-Glees. At the same time, the 101st Division would drop between the road and the sea. 2 regiments were to secure the 4 narrow causeways off the Utah Beach. 1 was to head south to cut communications and seize the important lock at La Barquette, which controlled the floodwaters of the Medere Valley. But the paratroopers had dropped far and wide. Only 2 regiments, 1 from each division, dropped in or near their drop zones. Others fell into the channel or behind enemy lines, some as far as 30 miles off course. Some fell right into St. Mary-Glees itself, and here flames from a burning building lit up the drifting paratroopers, and those caught up in trees were shot down before they could release themselves. 1 achieved lasting fame. Caught on the church steeple, he hung there for 4 hours, pretending to be dead, and watching with horror the killings below him. It was the first serious shedding of blood in the American sector, and when it was over, the Germans, amazingly, went back to bed and left the sleeping town open to capture. The Medere itself runs to the west of the town. It's a small river with well-defined banks. Aerial reconnaissance photos at the time gave the impression it looked much as it looks today, meandering slowly through level pastures. There was some higher ground. A railway embankment runs down the valley, lifted above the deep drainage ditches which were there to remove normal seasonal floodwaters. But a year before, in June 1943, the Germans had begun to open and close the gates of the lock at La Barquette, so at first the lower reaches of the Douve River were filled. Then the waters backed up to the Murderay Valley, flooding the flat pastures with 3 to 4 feet of water, as these German pictures show. It had been done deliberately to trap and impede an advancing enemy force. Unknowingly, the widely scattered paratroopers were coming in here low and dropping fast, weighed down with the massive equipment, ammunition, anti-tank grenades, entrenching tools. Falling into enemy fire, they were expected when they hit the ground to cut themselves free. Landing in the flooded pastures below, many failed to do so, as General Gavin saw for himself.
Well, I saw at least a dozen bodies of men who landed in the water. Wasn't more than about 2 or 3 feet deep in the ground. Because the parachute came right down on them, you see, and sealed it to the water. And they were very excited anyway. They were being shot at as well. And we lost a surprising number that way. We had bazookas, and you had to recover that. Without that, you had no defense against tanks. The little rifle wouldn't handle them. So we were desperately actually get hold of them. And one of the lieutenants was with me, took off all his clothes, absolutely stark naked, and went out into and he looked like a white statue stand out in the river, looking for the bazookas. Why he did that, I don't know. If he got wet, it didn't make any difference. He might be killed in the next few minutes anyway.
Those who did survive came out of the water to fight on without their support weapons lost in the flooded pastures. One objective taken early was Saint-Mary-Église. Here, preparing for German counterattacks, one commander, Colonel Vanderfort, fought on despite a broken leg.
When I first tried to get up and walk on the thing, there was enough pain that would made you sick to your stomach. Sometime during the early morning, the battalion surgeon came by, and he looked at it, and he laced the boot back up, and he said, "Don't ever take it off." And we went along like that. I used the rifle as a crutch momentarily.
At 10 o'clock on D-Day morning, Colonel Vandervoort called me over from the aid station, and he asked me to go down and cut some men out of the trees. So he gave me an officer and 6 men, and we went down into the square and cut 4 men out of the trees, carried their bodies to the village cemetery about 2 or 3 blocks down, buried them, and just about the time we got the 4th man down, a runner came. The Germans were making another attack.
Gliders were now crashing nearby in the tiny hedge-bound fields. Less than half reached their landing zones with much-needed ammunition, support weapons, and medical supplies. The first general killed on D-Day, General Pratt, died here, crushed in a collapsing cockpit. Others came through wounded, but still alive.
Just before we released from the plane, they killed either our pilot or our co-pilot. I don't recall which. But the other man who was piloting the plane tried to hold him up by the back of his collar. And the last thing I remember was he turned his head and said, "We're headed right for a tree." And most of them were killed.
3 German divisions held this area, 40,000 troops, including Baron von Heiter's battle-toughened 6th Parachute Regiment. It meant the Germans outnumbered the Americans by 3 to 1, and the thick hedgerows were easier to defend than attack. They were able to take on the scattered groups of advancing Americans in a series of small, bloody engagements, which were fought more for survival than for planned objectives. But the Americans kept moving, although some of the small groups, which had fallen anything up to 20 miles behind German lines, were captured as they tried to rejoin their units. One collection of 6 men, faced by 50 Germans hunting through a field for them, hid in a hedge until machine gun fire flushed them out.
I called out, and an English voice answered in the English language, and said, "Come out." So we came out, we all had our hands up, and we had these grenades. And we had, this is like a John Wayne movie, we had the pins in our teeth, you see, and the grenades in the right hand, and the carbine in the left hand. And he said, "Drop everything." And I said, "Don't be a darn fool." I said, "We dropped these, they're going to go off." "Oh," he said. Then he noticed we had these pins in our teeth, so he said, and they brought a guy behind each of us and put a pistol in our back and a submachine gun, and we were allowed to put the pin back in the grenade. And there's one said, there's one English-speaking German, he was Feldwebel, I think, sergeant. He said, "Proceed to Krieg fertig." For me, the war was over, he said.
Overall, it had been a hard fight, not according to plan and with many casualties. But the enemy had been surprised and had not been able or capable of launching an aggressive and coordinated counterattack. So at the end of the day, while the American southern and western flanks were not very secure, they were still firmly in Saint-Mary-Église and holding off German attacks. They were controlling the lock at La Barquette. They were in Poopville, where they had first made contact with the seaborne troops, and from there northwards controlled the 4 causeway exits from Utah Beach. They had not achieved all their original objectives, but against odds had gained enough ground for the day to be considered a general success. What they had done had enabled Utah Beach to be cleared quickly, allowing the seaborne infantry to land and move steadily forwards into the country beyond. The Americans were the first infantry to land on D-Day. Today, veterans come back to the huge cemetery at Colville, above Omaha Beach, where they suffered so many casualties. And where President Reagan and his wife walked for a few moments alone. Point du Hoc, which American Rangers scaled from the sea to attack German gun positions. The solid concrete observation bunker from which the fire was controlled is still there, and the view from it is just the same. These guns had to be silenced. Lying between the 2 American beaches of Utah and Omaha, Point du Hoc juts aggressively into the sea. It looks as forbidding in summer peacetime as it did 40 years ago, when it was used as a site for a German battery. Then, as now, a solid concrete observation bunker sits on the very tip of the point. From here, artillery officers could control the fire of the guns behind them. These 150mm guns had a range of 23,500 meters, so both American landing beaches were within range. In specially sighted gun emplacements, they were also a threat to any ships approaching the coast, and as mobile coast artillery, they could also be moved to alternative firing positions. It was the American Rangers who were given the unenviable task of destroying these guns, and they trained for this with British commandos in England, simulating as closely as they could the difficult conditions they knew they'd meet in scaling the 100-foot cliffs on the coast of Normandy. The battery at Point du Hoc had been bombed regularly, and on D-Day it was again a pre-invasion target. From the cliff edges, eaten away by the incessant bombing, the whole headland was pockmarked with enormous craters. Unknown to the Allies and the Rangers, 1 gun had already been destroyed and all the others had been moved.
We were supposed to land 5 minutes after the bombing and the shelling ceased. So we were half hour late, so the Germans were there waiting for us, and all hell broke loose. And we were using LCAs, British LCAs. We had rope, grappling hooks tied to ropes and rocket fired to the top of the cliffs. They say it was a futile attempt. 225 Rangers climbed this cliff. There were only 90 left that night. It wasn't futile. If the Rangers hadn't landed, those guns would have been used to kill a lot of American troops on Omaha and Utah Beach.
Establishing themselves on the edge of the cliff, the Rangers quickly recovered their surprise at finding an empty battery and no guns, and patrols set out to discover what the Germans had done with them.
They were being bombed silly with thousands and thousands of bombs from aerial bombardment and ships at sea. So they moved their guns in anticipation, days, maybe weeks before D-Day, into an alternate position. And incidentally, there were no shell craters or bomb craters around their alternate positions, so you see they had to wisely move them. We, through just pure luck, happened upon the guns in a little valley, and there they were all camouflaged in position, pointing toward Utah Beach, with all their shells and everything in readiness to be fired. And their men, about 100 or so of the Germans, were in a field about 100 yards away, being reorganized by their leaders, listening to their officers, and I went in the emplacement and took my thermite grenade and laid it in the hinges and the traversing mechanism and anything that could be melted by the thermite grenade to render the gun inoperable.
Omaha Beach, too, have been threatened by these big guns, and, in the desperate state in which the Americans were on that day, fire from Point du Hoc might well have tipped the balance against them. Their own Rangers' fierce assault on that cliff top, at great cost, had removed that threat to the landing beaches. The wide, wind-swept Utah beach lay on the extreme western edge of all the invasion beaches. Here, the very first of the 3 million invasion troops landed. There are now few reminders of that great feat of arms, nor of the horror and awfulness of that long, long walk through the waves, across the sand strewn with deadly beach obstacles, into the mouths of the German guns. These had, of course, been hammered and pounded from first light that summer morning. The Americans thought the French in the hamlets below had all been evacuated. They had not. One 10-year-old who lived through it is now Madame Lot.
La nuit, c'était quelque chose infernal, infernal, infernal. On croyait devenir sourd par l'importance des bombardements. Et puis les avions, c'était quelque chose de terrible. Nous ne pouvions pas rester dans la maison. Il n'y avait plus de toiture, plus de fenêtres, plus de portes. Et tout d'un coup, nous avons été obligés de partir dans une tranchée. Et on voyait les avions qui lâchaient les bombes. On ne pouvait plus respirer par cette odeur de poudre.
The Navy took over where the Air Force left off. And the first American casualties came crossing the only minefield laid offshore. But during this intense pre-landing barrage, the German guns kept silent, waiting for the troops now getting into their small landing craft for the run into the beaches. These were the men of the newly formed 4th Infantry Division, 23,000 of them, raw troops, untested yet in battle. Many of them were to be violently seasick, not the best way to begin fighting, for it was rough, uncomfortable, and very wet. Blunt-nosed, the small craft smashed through the waves with 13 miles to go, joining in the bombardment of the shore defenses. But the infantry were new to this and did not yet appreciate the real dangers.
Well, it was just like a show. We went in, we were looking at the planes bombing, and just like it was a Hollywood show. We saw the bombs falling, this and that. They dropped the ramp, and as we went in, the bombs just ceased, and it was just like a big play. But until they start shooting, you know, a few shells came, then you realized that it wasn't a play, but going in was beautiful. They dropped us in water up to my chest, and every man had at least 125 pounds. Well, I had a little fellow next to me, and he's down, so we picked him up, 2 of us, and said, now you walk, and we'll get you in. Get all the weight on, and it was up over his head, and he had the same experience. So we walked in, and he's going, poof, and he's blowing water out, but we walked him in because we were out too deep. Well, they couldn't get any closer. But we didn't lose a man on the beach, actually. We got right in.
On the spot they were due to land were very strong German defenses, guarding the 2 best exit points from the beach. But errors had brought the troops onto the beach at La Madeleine, 2,000 yards to the south. A fortunate error. The defenses here were weaker, though the exit could more easily be blocked. Already ashore, and 40 years older than most, was Brigadier General Roosevelt. He decided to capitalize on the error. A peppery little man, he told his men, we will start the war from here. Behind the sand dunes lay swampland, the only way across narrow causeways. At the far end would be the German defenders, but paratroopers dropped the night before had taken them, and the troops went across. It was along this stretch that the Americans, to their surprise, met the first French people, among them Madame Lot and her rather worried father.
Et mon père a dit, taisez-vous, taisez-vous, j'entends parler, écoutez, écoutez. Tout d'un coup, il a dit, mais j'entends parler anglais. Vite, il est sorti, et c'était un Américain qui était ici avec le fusil. Alors mon père a levé les bras, il dit, hey, Frenchman, Frenchman. Il dit, ah, parce que lui, je ne suis pas allemand. Alors...
And the Americans met more French as they moved quickly inland, reaching Saint-Marie-du-Mont by 11 o'clock, although German defenses halted their drive to link up with other paratroopers. Generally, however, the Germans were unprepared and had miscalculated both their own capabilities and the speed of the American advance. This speed and the desperate lack of radio communications confused both commanders on the ground and the men in their first battle experience.
In the evening, I kept thinking, well, we're in this field now, I wonder where the Germans are. We had them surrounded, but maybe they had us surrounded. And my thought was, gee, I hope it gets to be daylight again. And that's, I think we all felt that way. I think we prayed for daylight and we prayed for nighttime. And when nighttime came, we thought, gee, I wish it were daylight so we could get out of here and move somewhere else. I mean it, we all felt that way.
By the end of the day, the beach was clear and ready to receive more reinforcements. Although the relief column to beleaguered paratroopers at St. Mary Glees had still to get through, the 4 causeways were secure and the big guns silenced. The area held was smaller than planned, but stronger and better organized than might have been expected. The Americans were ashore. From the sand dunes by the beach at La Madeleine, the names of those who died are remembered, marking the roads where they fell as they moved inland to fight on in the rich farmlands of Normandy, to head towards the Cherbourg in the north, and to link up with their compatriots, fighting fiercely as they landed on the beach at Omaha. 10,000 Americans who died in the Normandy campaign lie here. 1 in every 10 of these graves in this vast cemetery on the bluff above Omaha Beach holds the body of a man who died here on invasion day itself. Men of the 1st Infantry Division who stormed ashore in a gallant, if somewhat reckless, frontal assault. For behind the beach was a steep bluff from which the Germans could dominate the beach below with devastating crossfire.
Now you think of it, it's rather awesome when I look down here from the Germans' view of us. I don't know. I don't think I'd want to do it again.
Even battle-hardened troops from North Africa and Italy were numbed.
I had a decided feeling that this was it. I wasn't going to make it anyway. I remember not even dropping to the sand or anything else when the mortar rounds came in. I just thought this was the end of the world, so why bother? The worst thing probably that I remember when we finally did come ashore is just the bodies rolling back and forth in the surf. We didn't know who they were, but they had the American uniform, so they were comrades.
Without the support of specialized British armor, which they'd spurned, the Americans were very exposed as they came through the tangle of beach obstacles. Moreover, the Germans were ready for them. Unlike other beaches, where they'd stood down defenses because of bad weather, they were actually on an anti-invasion exercise. The switch to the real thing was immediate, and so in the first 10 minutes, the American lead company lost nearly all its men.
As the 88s were coming in, I dropped on the beach, and there was dead bodies as well as live soldiers, and as I was ready to get up and move again, the man next to me, I nudged him and says, "Let's go," and he didn't move. I hit him again with my elbow, and then I looked over and I saw the poor fellow had a large hole in the side of his head. It was quite harrowing, because I'll tell you, I'm thankful that our vehicles did get sunk, because we would have had to drive on dead bodies. That's how many were on the beach at the time. There was no question about it. We would have had to drive over dead bodies.
Only 2 out of 29 tanks reached the beach. These survivors were lucky. Many crews were trapped and drowned. The beach was now becoming a shambles. The confusion of battle was taking hold. Those seeking cover began to pile up along with the wounded and the dead. There were few places to shelter, and the incoming tide began to take even that.
We were pinned down for about an hour on that particular sector of the beach due to the heavy fire. General Coda, who was the executive officer, came along on this sector of the beach, and he saw us crouched behind the wall, and he mentioned, "Who are you people?" So we said, "We're Rangers." So his exact words were, "Well, goddamn it, if you're Rangers, get up and lead the way."
When we finally cut through the barbed wire and everything like that, a shell hit close that the brush went on fire, and they told us to use a gas mask, which was no good. It just pulled in all that smoke into our faces, the ones that put it on. And then I didn't put it, and when I saw these guys suffering, coughing and everything, I figured, gee, what are they using on us now?
These German defenses were the strongest the Americans would have faced during the war. Such was the slaughter and chaos that German officers looking down were convinced the whole invasion was foundering and that the Allies would be thrown back into the sea. But now the Americans started to punch their way off the beach, acts of individual heroism getting them up the exit draws and through the minefields.
You had to go single file, and there was about 4 men laying there with their foot blown off from mines, and you could not walk on either. You had to just step over them, of course. There was mines on each side of you. They were more or less
they'd go up there, go as far as they could. They'd step on a mine, and another guy would take over and marking them, and if he stepped on one, and another one. There was 3 or 4 of them laying there.
The two sides tangled in the hedgerows, the Americans making the most of their mortars. Flamethrowers sought out the defenders, as inch by inch the Americans fought their way upwards under intense German fire. At great cost, the beach was taken. Movement became a little easier. Bulldozers came ashore to start building access roads, and the possibility of abandoning the beach altogether was now put aside. Only 100 tons of equipment out of an expected 2,500 had made it ashore. 1,000 men had died. But now the rest could begin to follow in the path which had been cleared, pushing a mile inland to the first villages. The big German guns had pinned down the American advance, so they moved forward only 1.5 miles in the Colville area, and even less than that west of Saint-Laurent. It was more of a toehold than even a foothold, and they were a long way from the planned beachhead boundary. Beyond the Americans' forward positions, enemy cut-off groups were still fighting hard. Behind them, the beach was under intermittent fire. Conditions were far from good, and there would be further delays in landing the follow-up troops. The terrible events which took place on these sands are seared into the memories of those who fought here. But there are other memories, too.
We're here today, you know, to not to tell about what we did, but out of respect for those that stayed here on the beach. And it's been a very moving experience. When we were in the chapel today and had services, it was a very deeply moving thing. You could feel the gratefulness of a small village.
The church is in the tiny hamlet of Colville, only 1 mile up one of the steep wooded exit draughts from the beach. Here, the villagers also remember in their own way.
As of today, from now on, it will be the avenue of the 1st Infantry Division.
A warm welcome, even though one American commander had thought their church steeple was a German observation post.
I could tell from pictures that they possibly had an observation tower in that steeple. And I made arrangement with the Navy that if they did not hear from me by 12 o'clock, blow that steeple off of there. Got into Colville, and I was right there in this little building. All of a sudden, I was knocked flat on the floor. They knocked it off of there with that first round. They put it right straight through that steeple. And I looked at my watch, and it was 12 o'clock. Just the Navy blew it off of there, just like I had asked them to do. And I had forgotten all about the fact that they were going to knock it off of there.
So the Americans come back, year after year, to remember both their deeds and their dead. For each of them, a personal pilgrimage to remember those who died as individuals, and to remember that the highest casualties had come from those who were first ashore, and also how that initial assault had gained them the momentum to carry the Allies into Normandy and on into the heart of Fortress Europe. At the British ceremony in Bayeux, the Queen and President Mitterrand of France remember the British and Canadians who fell in the Normandy campaign.
O God our Father, infinite in wisdom, love and power, have compassion on those for whom we pray. Grant them courage and hope in their troubles, and strengthen with thy mercy all who minister to their needs.
At Bayeux, the Queen honors the dead. At Arromanches, she salutes the survivors.
Gold Beach at the western end of the British sector provided perhaps the most successful assault, carried out by the men of the 50th Infantry Division. The problems here were again the fortified villages at the shore's edge and the soft sand making things difficult for the armour. But there was an additional hazard. The Germans had one of their most powerful artillery batteries at Long, and both the Navy and the RAF had failed to take it out. The objectives here were to capture Bayeux and link up with Juno Beach and the Americans at Omaha. At the end of the day, they were in the suburbs of Bayeux, but there was no link with the Americans. The only VC of the day was won here by the Greenhowards, whose colonel remembers.
I think that we were a fairly well-trained battalion, but dependent on the good NCOs. The best known, of course, is Sergeant Major Hollis, who got a VC, and he was a merchant sailor by nature, really, and he'd been in the army only in the war. He'd been in all the campaigns that they had ever had in the desert and in Sicily, and was a very, very brave man.
Stanley Hollis was Sergeant Major of D Company. He knocked out a machine gun pillbox single-handed, captured a whole trench full of Germans, and then rescued some of his own men by standing in an open field, firing his Bren gun from the hip until his men could run to safety. Men of the Dorset Regiment, on the way to take a gun position in a cornfield, found themselves in a tank battle.
Soldiers went down in the corn, and you had 16 wild elephants charging about. There was only one thing to do, and that was to get the soldiers away from those tanks. Now, that we did. As luck would have it, there was a lone tree over on the flank of the Germans. And I got my company over to the lone tree, not a German looking in our direction. So we wandered up from the flank and took the position with no problem at all.
Some units ordered to advance on Bayeux were given bicycles to speed up the process.
I set off straight through the smoke and things, like a cycling cub, literally. And in fact, as I was going along the road, my first casualty was there was a German 88mm firing from up on the Merville Ridge down at us. And we just sort of pedalled on, because our job was not to stop, but to get through somehow or other. And I looked round and found that this thing had fired solid shot at the chap behind me. And I found a chap pedaling a bicycle without a head on, which was rather worrying, crashed into the ditch. And that was my first casualty I saw. I had a sick feeling about it, but the obvious thing to do was to get on as fast as we could.
Surgical operating units were set up near the beaches within 6 hours of landing.
So we had everything to hand. We had transfusion sets, blood, we had penicillin. We simply used a stretcher for the operating table. We couldn't take an operating table in. Just we had a stretcher on, I think on boxes or whatever we could find. It was very, very crude, but it was, if you were going to save those people's lives, it was, the thing to do, was to operate on them as soon as you could.
One tank commander, even 40 years on, still names his house after the village he liberated.
I was fortunate, and I finished up out on the road going into the Hamill as the only armoured vehicle at that particular time. The crucial thing was to get into the Le Hamel behind the defences. We then swung round to the back of a pillbox which was housing an 88mm gun firing along the beach. And my gunner, he dropped a petard through the back door, blew this place up and eliminated that.
So the extraordinary day ended with the beachheads consolidated. There were some terrible battles to come. But these men knew they could not now be thrown back. The assault on Juno Beach was a combined operation using British and Canadian forces, and virtually all of the 24,000 men had a very rough time of it. The Canadians particularly had a horrible first 15 minutes reaching the sea wall. Juno was the middle of the 3 British beaches. Its main problem was that most of it was dominated by fortified villages built right by the sea wall. The beach's sand was soft and difficult for armoured vehicles. The task here was to move on Caen and link up with the other two beaches. At the end of the day, the troops had fought 2/3 of the way to Caen, but the 21st Panzer Division was between them and Sword Beach.
I saw this fella out a little further in the water, and he had been hit along with a lot of others, but he was screaming. As I was trying to point him toward the shore, I couldn't help him much. I was dragging my own self, my leg. He was hit, and he was just, something came over my shoulder, something really big, and he was just obliterated in front of me.
When I think back of all the fellows, and when I went to the cemetery in Benny-sur-Mer, and I saw all the names and that, it brought back memories. I could see their faces that I hadn't thought of for a great many years.
When I got to the wall, I saw that the pillbox was shooting our men who were lying on the beach. I had a standing on, and I got back a little from the pillbox and fired in through the aperture. And the machine gun stopped firing. All of a sudden, I just blacked out. It was a man in the pillbox who got up and fired through the top of the ventilator, and the bullet went through my helmet and the back of my head and scalped me and came out the other side.
Some of the British contingent landed west of the Canadians, finding themselves in an exposed landscape of sand dunes and fortifications.
We saw that the machine gun post just to our flank, actually. I only had about a strong fighting patrol of about 20 men. And I must say, you know, the chaps were first class, because they fixed burners and we just assaulted. It wasn't far to go, so we could go like the clappers, really, which we did go like the clappers, no question about it. They didn't put up any real fight, but I must say we must have killed about a good 20 or 30 chaps. And when we swept over the gun post, you know, you automatically, the guns, the heavy machine guns, light and medium. I remember going behind one, I thought, gosh, if I was in the defensive position, I could have held that for a week.
He just went straight in. Had this peculiar decisiveness about him. As well as great courage, and his courage was terrific. He made another attack on some houses, which were some weren't houses really. They were like buildings from which mortars were firing on the beach, and they just gave themselves up there. And he got the MC for that.
Lieutenant Moore was pretty courageous himself.
My job, in particular, was to get through this monstrous minefield, which is just behind the sand dunes. In the event, they'd been in the ground for so long, you couldn't get the fuses out. So we just had to pick the mines up and move them to one side. And some of these were booby-trapped as well, so which really slowed you down. At the same time, we were being shelled by some distant shelling, and also by mortar bombs, which are landing right in the middle of the minefield. And one difficulty there was that the mine detectors we were using made a continuous whistle on the headphones, and if you were going over this continuous whistle and there were these shells going off, you couldn't tell whether the whistle had increased or not. So you just had to take a chance sometimes.
As the support troops came in, the battle still raged.
We thought there'd be nobody left alive on that beach, and yet when we got there, we were landing craft were being blown up on the mines. The Germans were still there. They must have been like us. Felt exactly the same as we did. Absolutely shit scared. I'm sorry about that word, but I am a soldier. They must have been, and so were we. So we knew that when we landed, we had to get in. We had to take that beach. And if we'd have been driven back into the sea, it would have been the end of our beach, but it wasn't.
Our hold on Juno Beach was now unbreakable. Then began the laborious and dangerous business of clearing the villages in the advance on Caen. The men had their first taste of the murderous fighting in the orchards and hedgerows of Normandy, a slow process costly in lives, but taking Juno had given them the confidence they needed. They've not changed a lot, these beaches. They're now quiet reminders of the skill, courage and sacrifice required to take them. Sword Beach, at the extreme eastern end of the whole invasion area, was dreadfully exposed on its flank because of the estuary of the Orne River. Across the river was the 21st Panzer Division. The objectives here on D-Day were to link up with the airborne forces at Pegasus Bridge, to link up with Juno Beach next door, and to capture Caen. At the end of the day, the advance on Caen had moved only a few miles. The link with Juno was not made, but the vital relief at Pegasus Bridge had been accomplished. Everyone had a hard time coming in, not least the Royal Marine Corporal steering his assault craft with his feet.
When we actually got lowered, the stern sheetsman called out all clear, which told me that the hook was off and it was okay to get the forward off. We lifted the forward off and we got picked up by a sea and dropped. And as we come up again, the hook went straight into the Lincoln cockpit. As we dropped again, it ripped out. I tried to get it out, and because everything happens in such a flash, it ripped all the steering wheel out, and the telegraphs got damaged. And so there was no means of steering the ship. So I thought the best thing to do was have a go going over the stern, which I did, and it worked. What do you mean? I stood over climbed over the back, and put one foot on the rudder and one foot on the rudder guard. I steered it that way, 7.5 miles. It's a long way. It's an awful long way.
Immediately we lost no end of them. The weapons themselves were excellent weapons, but the precision weapons such as rifles and Bren guns didn't operate at all because the amount of sand thrown in that completely clogged up the working arrangements of them. So quickly we got to work with our pull-throughs, which is for cleaning the weapons and the bolts of our rifles and that. I lost the platoon sergeant alongside me on the beach when a shot from the shore hit the backside of the Bren gun and took it straight through his head.
Some went in singing Jerusalem, others rolled out the barrel, others recited Shakespeare's Agincourt speech, and there was one bagpiper.
I don't know what you, the brigade mayor, said, well, Millen, how about a tune? Well, now I can tell you that it seemed rather crazy to me at the time. All hell...
I've got to correct you. We weren't standing by the water. It was much too dangerous. It was in the sand dunes. We cleared the water's edge.
Anyway, I asked if I would play this tune. I play a tune. I said, what tune would you like, sir? You said, The Road to the Isles. Oh, that sounded crazy. Anyway, do you want me to walk up and down, sir? Yes, just march up and down, Papa.
Well, the shells are dropping in the water, and well, I don't think you can imagine a whiplash, a shock wave coming through the water. As soon as I hit the beach, I wanted to go. I wanted to move. I wanted to go, get away from that water. And I don't know. I think I went across that beach like a hare.
An immediate objective was to take the lock bridges at Weestrom, but there were only a few close combat Churchill tanks available.
I could see they'd be prepared for demolition because you could see the explosive charges and these cables that ran down the sides of the road. And the only chance we really had of dealing with it was to try and get within range of some safety fuses I could see burning at the far end. So we drove across the bridge fairly fast, the near bridge, cutting the detonating cord as we crossed with our tracks. And I was about to collect together all our brain gun teams for infantry-style attack across, when a white flag went up and out they came and surrendered. So that party was then marched off down to the beach.
How many?
I think it was 4 or 5 officers and about 150 other ranks.
The sequence of landing and the timetable that was kept was really remarkable. And here on this end, we've been responsible for bringing ashore about 30,000 men on this one sector with perhaps nearly 2,000 vehicles and 2,000 or 3,000 tons of stores.
You may wonder if Corporal Tandy, the human rudder, got back safely. He certainly did.
We were halfway hoisted, and my Sergeant Major, Colour Sergeant Francis, he was so delighted and he was so thrilled that I'd got them ashore and got back. He climbed over the run, he jumped on the landing craft, because I was still stuck below. I couldn't move, I was frozen. And he hauled me up, and tears streaming down his eyes, and he helped me over the whale. Got me over the whale. Well done, Corp, you know.
So the men who landed on Sword Beach pressed on towards Caen, not knowing that it would take another 32 days to capture the city. But the eastern flank of the invasion beachhead was in British hands, and would remain so.
At La Combe in the Cotentin Peninsula, the Germans too remember their dead. 3,500 on D-Day itself, and some 80,000 more as they tried in the weeks that followed to stem the Allied push into Normandy. Here, in these gentle Normandy fields, German soldiers lie forever in the soil of France. There is no difference now between conqueror and vanquished. Hitler, uncharacteristically, just could not decide which field marshal's advice to take about the defense of Western Europe. Von Rundstedt wanted his forces in deep reserve so he could deliver a massive, classical counterattack once the invaders were half ashore and vulnerable. Rommel, worried about Allied air superiority, wanted all the elite panzer divisions near the coast. He wanted any invaders stopped on the beaches, preferably at low water mark. But Hitler had given him just 3 divisions, only 1 for Normandy, keeping the others under his own personal orders. So Rommel instilled new urgency into building the beach defenses. The Führer's compromise would undoubtedly mean slow decisions when speed was vital. Touring the beaches, where bigger and stronger bunkers were being built, he personally instilled confidence and boosted morale. He told his men, if they come against us, we'll give them what for, and they won't come back a second time. The real strength of the German army now lay in the panzer divisions. These were well-balanced units, with infantry mounted on half-tracks, very mobile and hard-hitting. The men had been raised and trained to fight. Toughened on other fronts, they were accustomed to victory even against overwhelming odds. They had their own anti-aircraft and anti-tank guns. They were well prepared to meet an invading army, though the notable absence of the Luftwaffe made them vulnerable to air attacks. On the eve of the invasion, the Germans decoded a BBC message telling the French resistance the invasion was imminent. A preliminary alert was flashed to all commands except by mistake to Rommel's. But in this general muddle, and particularly because the meteorological report said the weather was too bad for an Allied invasion, most commanders had relaxed, including Rommel, who decided to visit Hitler to press his views and on the way take some leave and celebrate his wife's birthday with their son Manfred at home. All these plans came to an abrupt halt with the news of the paratroop landings in Normandy.
He was not pleased that he was at home. He was not pleased. But I don't think that he felt any guilt. But he would have liked, of course, to be in France, that he had been in France in the night from the 5th to the 6th of June, of course.
It was then the invasion fleet of some 4,000 ships of all shapes and sizes should have presented endless pickings for the Luftwaffe and the German Navy. But there was only one attack. In the pre-dawn darkness, Captain Hoffmann led his flotilla of E-boats at full speed down the channel.
Mit Höchstgeschwindigkeit lief ich weiter zum Westen.
We made our way westwards. We went through a smoke screen, and suddenly, the other side, we found ourselves in the middle of hundreds of battleships and destroyers, a real armada.
Es war eine Armada von Schiffen.
As soon as I was in range, I maneuvered to get the best line of fire, then launched all my torpedoes. We couldn't stay to see the result because we were coming under heavy fire.
One torpedo found its mark, the Norwegian destroyer Svenna. It went down in minutes. Another loss was the American destroyer Corrie, sunk by a mine. Captain Hoffmann and his crew only learned later of their success. He celebrated with his men, wearing new decorations for this exploit, which in fact marked the only success of the German Navy that day. The traditionally deadly U-boats didn't even get that far. One commander, Captain Kremer, had just returned from a patrol in which he'd sunk some 35,000 tons of shipping, despite damage from a ramming. But ordered out on D-Day, the voyage for him became a nightmare.
My memory was to have attacks, to have crash dives, to have bombing, to have death charges every day, every night, once, twice, 3 times, and it was really very tough and very hard to defend against such overwhelming superiority of air force.
Land forces, too, were dominated by Allied planes, smashing lines of communication and slowing down the advance of German reinforcements along the country roads.
Before D-Day, we were super optimistic about our ability to throw the enemy into the sea, as the official wording was. Although on this advance, our feelings were dampened a lot. We actually got shocked by this amount of air attacks. We were shocked because we were not prepared to this amount.
But the British have been right to worry about the panzer troops. Even though the 1 Normandy division started 9 hours late because of an administrative muddle, some units pushed through the Canadians and the British and reached the coast. The decision to hold the other panzer divisions in reserve meant these units could not be reinforced. They withdrew, the initiative was lost, and the threat to the Allies faded. The German newsreels told a very different story.
Ein Datum von weltgeschichtlicher Bedeutung.
Here the headlines proclaim the invasion had been at the behest of Moscow. The people were told the invasion was failing. Pictures backed up this claim, except these were not the Normandy beaches, but Dieppe, where a Canadian raid had failed 2 years before. And young troops were shown, strong, confident, and with high morale. In some cases, the Germans did fight stubbornly and well. Indeed, they kept the Allies out of more than half the territory they'd hoped to control by the end of that day. But they could only be as good as the support they received, and the fatal flaw in Hitler's compromise was now apparent to the senior commanders, if not to the men on the ground.
I think that Normandy has actually decided a Second World War. But I shouldn't say that it had broken the morale. The morale of the German troops were actually, in most cases, very high up to spring of 45.
3,500 Germans fell that day. They lie here with 20,000 others killed in the Normandy campaign. Some of the simple inscriptions are freshly carved, an unknown German soldier. For the bodies of those killed 40 years ago are still being found and brought here for burial. Caen, a key D-Day objective and the Allies' gateway to Europe. It was here the Queen came ashore at the start of the day. This was a personal visit, so she and the Duke of Edinburgh could pay their tribute to a city which had been utterly devastated in the bitter fighting which took place before it was captured. So it was fitting she was met simply by just the mayor of Caen and a single naval officer. The Germans held out in Caen for more than a month after D-Day. It became the crucible of the Normandy campaign, and everyone suffered. For the Germans were determined to hold it, and Montgomery was equally determined to use the city in 2 ways. First, by constantly attacking the city, Caen would act as a magnet to attract German reinforcements which could then be weakened or destroyed. Second, Caen would act as the hinge on which the door of the breakout would swing. As German pressure on the Americans eased, so they would be better able to push the door open and break out of Normandy into France and towards Germany. So began a series of armoured and infantry attacks on the city and the German positions around it. Battles that would inevitably lead to the almost total destruction of the city itself. As Montgomery had planned, the Germans were sucked into the fighting. These attacks built up to a crescendo of horror with a massive air raid. 2,500 tons of bombs rained down. This was followed by naval and artillery bombardments. Street by street, the capital of Normandy was being obliterated. Only the Cathedral of Saint-Étienne remained on the skyline, like some miracle, untouched. It was here, during this terrible time, that the French took refuge, and they continued to suffer, for the pressure on the city and them would continue until the Americans to the west had broken out.
gas stopped early in the morning, electricity went off, there was no water after that for months, and gas and electricity were restored only 8 months later. And the battle went on for 76 days until the last shell fell on Caen.
The Allied pressure increased. The Canadian and British armour and infantry pushed in closer. It was bitter fighting. By July the 9th, after 33 days of fighting, half of Caen was in Allied hands. The British and Canadians had suffered some 5,000 casualties. As the dust of battle began to settle, Montgomery arrived. The Allies were being welcomed despite the awful damage they'd inflicted on the city. And from the ruins, the French emerged to pick up the bits of their lives as best they might. The damage to the town was so severe, the soldiers themselves had difficulty moving through the streets piled with rubble. 40 years on, the damage of those devastating Allied attacks has been repaired, and the scars are healing. Today, kings, queens and presidents of Europe and America come together at last on the beach where the first invasion troops landed. It was here the Allies started on that great crusade, which was in the end to bring peace to Europe for the next 40 years. And it is here a simple memorial has been placed to remember them. The known and the unknown gather in the tents and pavilions for this great occasion, while outside, the young men of today's modern armies parade along the wide beach. The Queen and President Mitterrand climb through the sand dunes where the first fighting took place to watch the parade. This is probably the very last time such extensive ceremonies will take place here, for as the years roll by, so the roll call of veterans of D-Day shortens. That is why this 40th anniversary was marked in quite this way. The light infantry colour party leads the march off at a smart pace in front of the heads of state. But later, at Arromanches, it was a smaller and uniquely British occasion.
There are only a few occasions in history when the course of human destiny has depended on the events of a single day. June 6, 1944 was one of those critical moments. By the end of the day, 156,000 British, Canadian and American troops had landed in Normandy in the greatest amphibious operation in military history, and the Allies had regained a foothold on the mainland of Europe.
And at Renville, paratroopers and their families attend their own private service, which is held every year. And as the long, quiet afternoon wears on, so the pace slows, and so the searchings and the memories become more private.
Not the time for words, is it?
But battles are not won without casualties. Together with our partners in this vast and courageous enterprise, we have today paid homage to the thousands of Allied soldiers, sailors and airmen who gave their lives on the beaches and in the fields and villages of our ancient conqueror, William, Duke of Normandy. We honor the memory of those men and women, of the Allies, the Free French and the Resistance, who died to restore freedom to France and to the world.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.